It's been 1 month since Armenia's parliamentary elections, and in our last State of Play episode, which was just 2 days after the elections, we looked at the results and we talked about what they might mean for the country's political future. Now that we've had some time to step back, and a lot of people just want to forget about the elections and some
Or move
days
on.
and move on. But if we step back from the immediate reactions that we had and look at the numbers more carefully, what do you think this election actually tells us about the evolution of Armenian politics? Because I think you, in your comparison with the 2021 elections, came up with some interesting insights.
Yeah, so we had a recent piece on this, did a kind of a very deep dive in the numbers and the results of the elections. So there's like two kind of theories on this. One is that the opposition or the anti-Pashinyan vote just grew. And by virtue of that, sort of, we saw what I'm calling sort of like an anti-incumbency base.
It grew quite
Right.
robustly.
So we saw based on 21 about a 6 to 7% growth. Okay, right. So there was a purely sort of speaking on the numbers, you had about a 7% growth based on 21. So you're thinking, you're definitely seeing a anti-incumbent base. I'm not going so much off of the growth, but the fact that the anti-incumbent base remained consistent and then it grew, right?
Remain consistent, what do
From
you mean?
21.
Okay.
So we're seeing a pattern, right? So you look at the sort of like the three dominant political parties that represent the anti-incumbent or the anti-Pashinyan faction. They went from about roughly 31 and a half collectively in 21 to about 37 and a half in 26, so you had a 6% growth. Now, of course, there are some conversations when you look at the data. About 3 to 4% of this was related to possibly, Russian Armenians coming into vote. The numbers are close to about 15 to 20,000 that came in. There's been discussions of vote buying, but that in of itself didn't shift the electoral outcome. But when you're playing in the margins of 3 to 5%, 3 to 4%,
Makes a
this
difference.
becomes very interesting. That's what I'm saying. To control for things, let's say we put the increase aside, because some could say, well, it was due to vote buying, it was due to this or to that. Let's say you put that aside. The 31, 32% still remains strong. This is why we speak of an anti-incumbency base, right? So we've seen in a 5-year time span the consolidation of that. That was one very interesting observation. The second was we saw an incremental drop with civil contract from about 54% in 21 to roughly 50%, 0.87,
49.87,
whatever, so
something.
roughly 50% with this election. And we had spoken about this before when we did a couple of podcasts on the elections. In the scholarship, in the literature on elections, there's a concept known as cost of ruling.
Right.
And I want to introduce that in our conversations and in the discourse. And the reason why it became so fascinating because the research on cost of ruling basically says the incumbent party, roughly from election to election, will see a diminishing outcome from 2.5 to 4%. This is precisely what we saw with civil contract.
Right. Let me just interrupt you here because one of the things that I found particularly interesting about this cost of ruling thing was that you don't interpret civil contracts sort of reduced vote share as a sign of democratic backsliding or democratic decline, but quite the opposite. You're arguing that this is what happens in functioning democracies.
Definitely.
The burden or cost of ruling. So
yeah, I mean, that's what we're looking at. The incumbent party consistently winning, for example, isn't a sign of democratic consolidation. So actually, the incumbent party's numbers diminishing is a healthier indicator of democratic growth. At the same time, the high voter turnout was also an indication of democratic growth.
58.76%. That was
Right. I
pretty
mean,
high, yeah.
we talked about in our model when we did all the polling, we were anticipating about 55%. because it was pretty low in 21, so you want to mitigate. So this was an excellent sign, right, of citizens kind of engaging using the ballot box for political grievances or support, whatever the case might be. And so when you take all those together, you see actually an indicator of democratic political cultural growth, as opposed to the dominant democratic force saw a diminishing number, therefore the democratic process slowing down. That's not what's happening, right? Because the average citizen didn't go to the ballot box and vote based on some ideational leaning for democracy. For them, they were participating in the democratic process.
And pocketbook issues.
So that's kind of a big part of what we're talking about as far as to understand voter preferences. Okay, economy was a big part of this. Pension reforms, healthcare reforms, universal healthcare was a big part of this. So a very interesting question comes up. You have a government, you have an incumbent party that, relative to all other governments in Armenia, has, in comparative terms, has done more with respect to economic growth, with infrastructure building, with universal health care, with pension increases, right? So in comparative terms, right, this incumbent had done more than all other incumbents previously in relative terms. Yet, it underperformed, right, compared to 2021 by 4%.
Why?
Cost of ruling, right? Also, with cost of ruling comes a concept, and we talked about this as well, it's basically known as asymmetrical grievance theory. Not to get too academic, right? But this theory basically says that, citizens, because their expectations of the incumbent increases through time, the incumbent could do like 10, 15 positive things, and they're obviously going to do 3 to 5 negative things. The citizen, the voter, is going to, right, prioritize or concentrate more on those 3 to 5 negative things over those 10, 15 positive things. Thus, their grievances become asymmetrical. And so the neutral observer, they might be like, well, the incumbent did all these things right. They had a few defects. Why are these defects being amplified as relevant or to the same level as the positive outcomes? That is the cost of ruling.
Okay, I get that. But we have to remember, between 2021 and 2026, we had the attacks against the Republic of Armenia. We had the attack on Artsakh and the loss of Artsakh and the ethnic cleansing of the Armenian population of Artsakh. Could this government's handling of that situation have also played a role in their diminished vote share?
We haven't seen any evidence of that. Because when we looked at the polling, right, and it's not just EVNZR polling, it was IRI polling, the number one issue was peace, security, and then economy, right? So the issue of Nagorno-Karabakh was never a top salient issue with the Armenian public. Whether we like it or not, that's what the data shows, right? The ethnic cleansing of Nagorno-Karabakh was not a top priority issue for the Armenian voter, just going off. And the question was there, right? But it was always in the bottom, like around 6th or 7th place. So the top areas that allow us to understand voter preferences, what policies drove the voter, was peace, security, economy, education, healthcare, things of that sort. So we don't have, obviously there were some voters clearly that had, that this was a defining issue for them. But when we look at sort of the shifts, right, there's not enough evidence for us to say that that was the issue. Also, I don't think the majority of Armenians, or the plurality of Armenians that tilted for the incumbent party, I don't think those who voted for the incumbent party were okay with the ethnic cleansing.
No, of course
right?
not. Of course
so
not,
in that context, right, we're not seeing a relation. Many were like very upset about it, obviously.
Sure.
But they understood that from their perspective, there are other priority issues such as Armenia's sovereignty, security, economic growth. So it's a bit of a conundrum in that context. So we don't have evidence that suggests the loss of Nagorno-Karabakh, Azerbaijan's continued occupation of Armenian territories was basically produced a detrimental vote.
Okay, before we get into more of the numbers, because I found it, as I said, quite fascinating. As a political scientist, please explain something to us. In a parliamentary system, for any ruling party to consistently maintain a high percentage of the vote, right, during election cycles, is like you said, because of the cost of ruling. Do we see let's take European countries that have similar systems, we don't see a single party getting up to 50% of the
No.
vote, right?
Right. No, it's
So this is, I think this is important for us to understand.
right. So Armenia is not a consolidated democracy, right? We're a developing transitional democracy. So it would not be fair to compare our political system at this point with the developed democracies of
Sure.
Europe, especially their parliamentary democracies. So in that context, right, European or just Australia, Israel, whatever, Canada, right, parliamentary democracies. I mean, parliamentary democracies are defined by plurality of parties competing and then coalition forming. So it's very rare to see 50 plus by one party. It just that's not how it works, right? Even the UK, which has a three, max four party system, right? Competitive parties. Unlike, all other European parliamentary democracies, you never see Labour getting 50 plus or the conservative Tories getting 50 plus. So it's extremely rare in parliamentary democracies. Armenia, because it's in a transitional process, right, and because the dominant incumbent party happens to be, for all its flaws, the dominant Democratic Party, there are no robust Democratic alternatives, so it is the only one that keeps getting close to 50%.
Right. But for us to expect it to continually do that,
It's
and then to
not-
say, well, you see, look what happened.
It's not tenable. And if you keep in continuous elections seeing the incumbent winning consistently 50 plus, that's going to
other
bring
red
up
flags.
concerns about your democratic process or
Right.
consolidation.
So I want to talk, because again, these are things that were interesting to me, about the youth vote. Let's look at the numbers in terms of age
Right.
and gender. So youth turnout remained low. Actually, it declined slightly in these elections compared to 2021. And again, for me, this is, incomprehensible. But you have said, as somebody who studies, is that usually youth don't turn out as
In
robustly in
democracies, right.
democracies.
They're always the lowest voting group
Right.
in
And
all these countries.
another interesting thing was that more women voted than men.
That's been consistent in Armenia.
How do you explain that?
I
Because
don't know if Armenian women just do things better, generally
well, look,
speaking.
this we knew.
But politically, right. So, in 21, the gap was close to like 8% between the
Right,
male
men
and
and
female
women,
vote,
right.
right? So women made up about 53-54% of the vote, and men made up about 44 to 45% of the vote. So this is nothing new, right? What we saw in 26 for Armenian politics. Women turn out, they're more responsible when it comes to civic duties than men. That's just how our electoral field functions. So 26 was actually very consistent in the gender vote compared to 21. What was very interesting with the 26 election, when we sort of disaggregate the data and look at the age groups, is, as you noted, the 18 to 35, which will qualify the youth, the numbers did go down compared to 21.
Yeah.
And most were thinking you had a long campaign season, heavy digital, Facebook, online campaigning, TikTok, Instagram targeting youth.
Yeah, influencers
compared
were,
to 21,
trying
right?
to pull the vote,
So you would
right.
expect an increase. It was the opposite, which again is consistent with, as I know, a lot of democracies, the youth just simply don't show up to vote.
I would understand that in a country, where I grew up in Canada, where things are relatively stable, normal. You don't have a lot of intense periods of conflict. In a country like Armenia, where so much is at stake, you would think that the youth would be more motivated to actually take part in the process. So, I mean, I'm not saying that you should have an answer to that.
Well, there's two schools in this. One is basically a lot of times the youth are kind of sheltered from the complexities or the
Or they
issues
shelter
that
themselves, maybe,
could be,
to protect
right?
them. Their.
Also, that's one way of looking at it. Also, we're very sort of, Armenian culture is quite different, that youth are always sheltered and protected by parents, extended family, whatever the case might be. And also, Armenian youth are not very politically engaged. Most, for example, there's been anecdotal data on this, don't remember March 1, 2008. Right, most don't
October
remember,
27,
right,
yeah, 1999.
corruption cases or this or that. Many youth probably couldn't tell you the ministers that make up Armenia's
No, I
government,
know, because
right?
for me that was always fascinating, because in my family we're always talking about politics. So when I also teach at the American University, and I would talk to students and I would give them a name of a former foreign affairs minister, and they would have no
Right.
idea. And for me it was
But that's not
shocking.
uncommon, because that's most of how most of the youth are in
I
other
guess so,
developing or
yeah,
developed
yeah.
democracies. That's one aspect. The second is that in the last 5 years, for all the security issues and the process of normalizing, Armenia has seen robust economic growth, and so when livelihood increases, quality of living increases, expandable income increases, and youth are able to basically live a lifestyle that, from their perspective, is very similar to their European partners, or other youth in different parts of the world, that also change their perspective, where they'd rather be on TikTok watching dance videos as opposed to a debate in parliament.
When they're yelling at each other,
Yeah,
so it
yeah.
doesn't
So,
help.
in that context, it's perfectly normal with respect to the
Yeah.
data on this. What was really interesting when we disaggregated the data is the increase in the vote from the age group of 35 to 50.
Okay, I thought you were going to say over 65,
That's
because we
that's
also saw, yeah.
yes, but 35 to 50, we saw basically an increase of almost 100,000 voters compared to 2021.
Why?
One, a lot of these voters, or a big chunk of these voters, were youth, part of the youth group in 21, and now that they
What
are
do you mean they were
basically,
part of the youth group? And
well, they were part of
they
the
were
18 to
considered,
35
okay.
group, right? So now, in 5 years, you've grown up. So you politically behave differently when you're, say, 27, 28. But when you're like 35, at this point, maybe you have two children, or you're married, you have a family, you become politically more involved. Also, the research shows that the more you see growth of a middle class, the more they become politically affluent and involved. And Armenia is seeing a growing middle class. And a growing middle class always demands political accountability.
Right.
And that is usually expressed through the ballot box. So this was a very interesting trend that was observed. And based on the data, as you kind of noted, the increase in this age group suggested, relatively speaking, a tilt towards the opposition.
Again, if this is the group that is part of the growing middle class, because we do have a small growing middle class in Armenia, why would they vote for the opposition and not the incumbent, like you mentioned, who had introduced certain reforms that benefited their lifestyle?
Asymmetrical grievance, right? This is very interesting. So, anybody that's visiting Yerevan, for example, or the country, you go to countryside, you go to rural areas, nice roads, better infrastructure, the roads from
Not
here to
perfect,
Gyumri
but
and
yeah,
all this
much
stuff, right?
better.
And so these are resonating, and to a certain extent, with older voters, because they're like, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, it was horrible. We see conditions improving. Of course, we're going to vote for the incumbent. That's why the age group of 65 and over, we saw a 130,000
It was
increase
crazy.
compared to 2021, right? So older voters, those who have a deeper political memory, are the strong base of the incumbent. Now, a lot of these, the middle voters, right, age group that were part of the youth that transitioned, they have seen economic growth, as you noted, right? But at the same time, they're seeing more fluency, and they're becoming a middle class. The middle class is always going to hold the feet of the incumbent
to the fire.
And so these are very interesting trends. A lot of times it's not intuitive. That's why political science comes to these things and explains that. You would think more economic fluency, right? Rising middle class, preference for the incumbent. That's not always the case, because the expectation is all middle class, but things are expensive.
Right.
There's inflation, okay? I hold the government accountable. So you might be like, well, yeah, but there's like 10 different things we just mentioned that the 65 and over group is crediting the government. This voter is like, yes, but there are three other things like inflation, like expensive groceries that I'm very upset for. And to me, that is just as important, if not more important, than the 10 other things you mentioned. This is the asymmetrical component of grievances that's very unique and allowing to understand what's going on.
So what we can discern from these elections is that we have now a more competitive political landscape, right? And perhaps a maturing, not democracy, maybe maturing is the wrong word, but like you've said many times, we are still not a consolidated
We have a
democracy. Are we on?
maturing electorate.
Okay.
Yeah.
And like you said, where governing parties are increasingly held accountable, right?
Absolutely.
Whereas before they weren't. I mean, well, before it was different, but
So what we're seeing is, and we just kind of want to look at the domain of accountability and shifts. What many have gone off of data in the past has been, Yerevan, right? More affluent parts of Yerevan specifically, but Yerevan itself has always been difficult for the incumbent electorally.
They perform slightly better this
Exactly,
time.
right. But prior to these elections, right?
Right.
Yerevan was always difficult for the incumbent, while the rural areas, what we call Pashinyan territory. In the 26 elections,
Things
to your
shifted,
point, very interestingly, right? Pashinyan civil contracts still dominate the rural areas, but we saw on average 7 to 10% decrease in the rural areas compared to 2021. But with Yerevan, civil contracts numbers held and they even slightly increased. And when we look at the most affluent areas of Yerevan, Gentron and Arapgir areas, civil contracts numbers actually went up 4 to 5%. So it's very interesting, right? If we go off the previous data, rural areas, the urban-rural divide, right? Rural is heavily civil contract, urban is more anti-incumbent. 26 is interesting. It kind of slightly shifted that trend. This is an indicator of a growing and a more sophisticated electorate, where we cannot simply pigeonhole Armenia, right? The peasantry for the incumbent and the urban
more
elite.
Affluent,
right. So these are very interesting developments, and that's an indicator of our electorate becoming more sophisticated in a sense, voting on issues as opposed to blindly voting for leaders. Again, we're not there where you expect that kind of behavior across the board, right? But these are very important developments that we're seeing.
Coming back to your observations between 2021 and 2026, what was the one thing that stood out that you while you were doing, because I know that you spent hours looking at the data, comparing the numbers.
More than hours.
Okay, days. What is the one thing that sort of really caught you off guard?
What not so much caught me off guard, but was inconsistent with data trends was the performance of the anti-Pashinyan faction, the anti-incumbent faction, or perhaps the underperformance of the incumbent in the urban cities or the cities outside of Yerevan. For example, in Gyumri, right? Pashinyan's or civil contracts numbers compared to 2021 in the city of Gyumri were quite low. Or we'll look at the Marses, right? The Lori Mars, the opposition got basically 40%.
Yeah.
Which we haven't seen, right?
But that could
from
be
2018.
conditioned by Samvel Garabedian being from Dashir.
Dashir is one small city or village or community in all of Lori. Vanadzor has never been, quote unquote Dashi territory or strong Armenia or Armenia alliance territory, right? But what we saw, these very interesting developments that the major cities of the rural areas saw an increase in the anti-incumbent vote. And that's a very unique indicator. And that's why we saw, as I initially noted, right, why the numbers of the incumbent was relatively lower in the collective rural areas. That was something that we really stood up. And then, as I noted, what was really surprising for me was the outcomes in Yerevan. When you're seeing the incumbent and the cost of ruling taking effect across the board, you would expect it to affect in their weakest electoral areas,
right?
The affluent, wealthy parts of Yerevan. And so when they're underperforming in the rural areas, which are their base, but overperforming in the affluent areas of Yerevan, which is their weakest area.
So there's some.
This was a very, very fascinating development that I were able to kind of diagnose. Now, I don't know, right, why civil contracts numbers went up in Arapgire and Kentron, which they've always struggled with in the 23 municipal elections and the 21 elections as well. So we don't know the numbers, why that is the case. But these were kind of the two main things that kind of I thought to be unexpected in relation to electoral patterns.
Okay, I want to talk now about the parties themselves. Like, let's look at civil contracts. So this is their third election cycle. Yes, we've seen reduction in their vote share, but they've been able to maintain power. So this will be their third term. And for years we've heard that Pashinyan's support was largely personal, especially in the rural areas. People, he spoke their language. He spoke the things that they wanted to hear, like the ordinary man. But does this election suggest that civil contract, maybe this is a stretch, but just bear with me, itself has become a real political party, a durable political party, rather than simply, a vehicle for Pashinyan? Because if we were to take Pashinyan out of the mix, what would we have?
That's a very good question. So civil contract most definitely is institutionalized as a political party.
Okay.
And when we look at sort of the scholarship on this, right, the biggest problem with underdeveloped or developing democracies is that you don't have institutionalized political parties. In the West or in developed democracies, uninstitutionalized political parties are not considered to be political parties. They're ad hoc factions that compete and then disappear. Political parties have to continuously have a process, structure, they have to be consolidated. That's why the term institutionalized is very important. So, for example, like the Republican Party, okay, they're semi-institutionalized, meaning while they're dominated, while they're dominated by Nerses Kopalyan, right, they have a 15, 20-year legacy of a broader national infrastructure. So if Nerses Kopalyan, for example, is no longer involved in politics or at some point due to age or whatever passes away, the party would not die.
But the party did not participate in the elections. How do you explain that?
The party had some infrastructure. They just simply chose to support strong
Armenia.
Armenia. That was a strategic preference. But preferences of a party and their actually institutional structure are two different things. I'm looking at the anatomy of political parties. That was kind of an example. But again, it's a semi-institutionalized party.
Prosperous Armenia, I wouldn't consider them a political party because you remove Gagik Tsarukyan.
There's nothing there. Exactly. So civil contract. Civil contract had primaries, for example, this year, right? Which is a very unique and original introduction to democratic politics borrowed from other democracies. They recently had an internal voting process to select Speaker of Parliament, so on and so forth. These are institutional processes where one person doesn't appoint leadership, right? And then everything is contingent on them. Definitely Prime Minister Pashinyan's legacy from the Velvet Revolution, from him being a reformer, his retail politics, his relative charisma is one of the most important aspects that gets votes for civil contract. But if you take Pashinyan out of the equation, as you noted, will civil contracts survive? Of course they will. Will it be as good as it is in electoral politics? Very likely not. So it is a semi-institutionalized political party, but it is not fully institutionalized at this point. We will be able to better gauge their level of institutionalization in 2031 if, for example, Pashinyan decides not to run.
Or if he decides to run again, I think that would be the end of... anyway, that's
a different question, right?
Yeah,
we're speaking in the domain of... So let's assume that in 2031, he doesn't run, okay? How will the party perform? What would be the process of the party choosing their number one person on the list, PM candidate? So these are the things that we're looking at, these processes.
Right.
Absolutely. So to answer your question, civil contract is a semi-consolidated political party, but it doesn't have the level of institutionalization that we see in, Europe,
in other established democracies.
Yeah.
Okay, so conversely, what does the election tell us about the opposition? Because that's also very interesting.
And this is where we get into sort of a concern area. It shows that the opposition does not have institutionalized political parties. You mentioned Prosperous Armenia Party, that is not institutionalized or even semi-consolidated. Armenia Alliance is an alliance. It's an
Right.
ad hoc concoction of Kocharian loyalists and the ARF.
Which is
ARF
a political
has
party
ARS has
institutionalized.
a
Yeah,
legacy
of
of
course.
definitely semi-institutionalization, but when they play second fiddle, right,
Right.
to an ad hoc
Yeah.
construct, this
This is
creates
what
concerns
happens.
of institutionalization. And of course, Strong Armenia is not a political party. They're put together in the last few months of the elections. They took some people from Armenian Alliance. They took some people from the Republican Party,
Yeah.
right? And so again, institutionalized political parties have to at least win or participate competitively in 2 election cycles based on a lot of the literature on this stuff, and then have internal processes where you see changing leadership and selection processes, decision-making processes. So we're not there yet with the opposition. What would be very interesting is, does Strong Armenia participate nationwide in the upcoming municipal elections? And what is the outcome? Does Strong Armenia participate in the upcoming 28 Yerevan municipal elections, right? How do they perform? And if they continue to demonstrate performance, right, and come 31, where they're relatively semi-institutionalized, then we would see that. But as of now, a 4-month-old party
It's
cannot
difficult to
really
say.
consider to be a political party.
We're looking at the 26 elections, and obviously we had Armenia Alliance, we had Strong Armenia, and we had Prosperous Armenia as the three top sort of contenders in the opposition field. Is it still primarily united to opposition to the government, or does it have a governing agenda? Does it have a vision? Do you know what I'm saying?
This is a very good question. I don't think it does.
It was just in opposition to Pashinyan.
Right. So there are two schools on this. Not to politicize things. One school, which I to some extent subscribe, is that these are not viewed as political parties, but more like Russian proxies who are more involved with destabilization activities. That's one school. The other is, no, these are opposition parties. Yes, they might be more sympathetic or leaning towards Russian interests, but they represent an electoral base in Armenia. Therefore, they are political parties or legitimate opposition forces. Two things could be true at the same
Sure.
time. But when it comes to governing agenda, there's a very interesting thing, right? What we have seen with the opposition parties or factions is basically opposing everything that the incumbent presents. So they're generally anti-TRIP, or they're generally anti-U.S. Armenia relations. They're anti-EU integration.
Right.
But they're, again, returning Armenia to Russia's security architecture, further integrating Armenia in Russia's economic structure, so on and so forth. So the general sense you get is their entire programmatic approach to governing Armenia is to make Armenia some kind of a Belarus-sized extension of Russia. If one wants to consider that a governing agenda, be that as it may, right? But in the domain of domestic politics, that doesn't really give much to go off of with respect to policy areas. And if your answer to everything is Russia, security Russia, economy Russia, education Russia, cultural affinity Russia, that creates some kind of problems.
But I think it's very important, because you also mentioned this in your article, that everyone who voted for the opposition wasn't necessarily anti-democratic or pro-Russia.
Absolutely.
They were looking for an alternative. Many people were looking for an alternative.
Definitely.
So, and we talked about this
Right.
in our last episode. It's not black and white. It's pro-West and whatever.
That's why I know that the Armenian electorate has become more sophisticated. Right. We don't have sufficient data to disaggregate, but for example, just sort of going off of informed observations, I would say big chunks of the strong Armenian voter is very likely pro-EU.
Yes.
Very likely supports TRIP, but due to some iteration of grievance asymmetry, are unhappy with the incumbent. And so while they may be happy with some geopolitical components, They don't like Pashinyan, and
Sure.
so they voted for Strong Armenia. It doesn't mean that voter is intrinsically pro-Russia and anti-West. That's why pigeonholing the Armenian voter into a dichotomy is inconsistent with what we're seeing out
Yeah,
there.
absolutely. Okay, so the election is over. It's been a month. What do you think the government's biggest political challenge will be over the next year?
Definitely institutional reforms. Biggest challenge. We've talked about this in the past.
No, of course, of course.
This is what's going to define if Armenia becomes a consolidated democracy by 2031, if Armenia addresses its security and economic issues, or it doesn't and it remains in a state of purgatory where we're constantly transitional. Okay, institutional reform is what's going to define it.
Okay,
This
what?
isn't open to debate,
No, I
right? Yeah.
completely agree.
No, not with you in generally speaking.
But okay, but what about the peace process? What about Armenia's realignment geopolitically? Are these things? What about TRIP? What's happening with
So,
TRIP?
so
What's
these
happening
right.
with
I think these are low-hanging fruit, to be honest.
Are they?
Absolutely, and so that's why I'm being very honest. Right, institutional reforms right now are a lot more difficult for us than the normalization process, because much of the normalization process we've spoken about the success rate has been structured. Okay, barring a systemic collapse, right, of the South Caucasus, or Russia overnight addressing the Ukraine issue and returning, and the United States basically overnight abdicating all their investments, right? I mean, we're talking about absurd black swan developments. Realistically speaking, the structure, the systemic developments in the region have produced all the foundational basis for the normalization process to proceed. We're not where we need to be, but the process is there. Economic growth, the process is there, right? The geopolitical developments, Europe is now heavily investing in Armenia. The United States is heavily invested in Armenia. India is becoming an important partner. So on, we've talked about successively. So all those things are already there for the newly elected government, the continuous incumbent, to take those and proceed. That's why it's low-hanging fruit, because they don't have to start from scratch. The infrastructure is there. Okay? Institutional reforms are a lot more difficult than these issues that we're talking
Okay,
about.
I'm going to stop you there for a second, because during his last rally before the elections, Prime Minister Pashinyan said that it is absolutely imperative that they secure a two-thirds majority to have a constitutional majority or a supermajority in order to be able to enact, whether it's constitutional referendum or civil contract after 2021, even though they didn't have a supermajority, they couldn't
A
do
constitutional majority,
right. They still had the ability, right, to do vetting of judges.
Oh, they had more than 3/5 to implement all these reforms.
So they didn't do it. So what guarantee do we have now that they will in fact do these? I agree with you. If we don't do these institutional reforms, we will begin a backsliding.
Definitely. And it's not a question of backsliding. I think the term backsliding has been
Okay, you don't like that
used.
word, yeah.
No, because in the scholarship, it's just there's different meanings to this. In Armenia, they tend to use terms without understanding it. What you won't have is the consolidation of your democracy. So you'll be in the state of limbo.
And
Just
technically
kind of
could
up and down.
backslide.
It could backslide, it could move forward,
Okay.
but that is not a healthy place to be. It's what we're
Absolutely,
talking
yeah,
about. I fully agree with you in the sense that, do we have any guarantees? Well, of course we don't, right? But let us basically look at this sort of two different prisms. One prism is post 2021, 2022, 2023, the security environment overwhelmed, dominated the whole entire landscape, and it was only in 2025 with the
2024.
with the Washington Accords. That was in 2025.
No, I know, but there was a year before 2025
Right.
where we weren't in constant.
True, but you're still at a state of conflict, right? So it was post Washington Accords where Armenians could breathe. We've talked about this extensively, right? So I'm not saying it's a justification, but a lot of the discourse is that until the Washington Accords, where we knew that the probability of war had exponentially diminished, can you then start thinking about reforms and allocating your resources to that? But at the same time, there's another school that says if you're a state, you should be able to, walk and chew at the same time,
Right.
right? You should be able to do things in parallel. So yes, security environment is very complex, but judicial reforms or prosecutorial reforms shouldn't be basically put in the back bunker.
I'm just
Right.
wondering, did the Ministry of Justice stop
Stopped
functioning?
working. Exactly. And so these are but in a domain of political will and trying to maintain some level of structural, institutional, bureaucratic stability because you have a certain security environment, be that as it may. To answer your question, why is post 2026 going to be different is because you've had the Washington Accords, you do have a normalization process, you do have TRIP as you know it, you do have immense European investments. You have European markets opening to Armenia. So the environment that the government Armenia finds itself now is exponentially improved compared to the previous term.
But you also have Russian blockade of Armenian products.
And you have the Europeans finding solutions to that, right?
Okay.
So
Stopgap measure. Is it?
Is a stopgap,
Is
or
it?
it could be systematized. But those things, right? You find solutions, you move forward. What I'm saying is, you are no longer in a position to say, I'm going to deprioritize reforms because I am dealing with the life or death existential issues, right? The existential threat has been diminished, right? So, in that context, the justifications or the general understanding that you had prior to 2025, right, which limited reforms, no longer exists. So, right now, if the argument is we have peace on the ground, we're moving towards peace, we're moving towards unblocking, we're moving towards interconnectivity, excellent, 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 excellent. So, then why aren't you moving forward with reforms, right? And so, in that context, it becomes imperative and you have zero room to justify why you are not implementing reforms. Now, you asked about the peace process. You mentioned Russian restrictions on us. All of these are connected to institutional reforms. There's a reason why Armenian products aren't in European markets because your institutions are underdeveloped, your standards are underdeveloped, your agricultural products are underdeveloped, etc., etc., etc. Therefore, you cannot enter those markets. There's a reason why you have to a large extent the security situation that you have because your security institutions are underdeveloped, right? Your security apparatus is underdeveloped. You reform those, you become stronger. You reform the other areas, you become better. And so it's all interconnected. So in that context, the peace process, normalization, economic integration with Europe, addressing Russian restrictions or subversive activities, developing resilience. You can't do any of this properly without strong institutions. And so at the end of the day, when we talk about a strong state, what we're basically talking about are strong institutions because this is what makes up a state.
Of course.
Most Armenians don't make that connection. We have this understanding in Armenia that institutional reforms are only about the democratic process. You democratize. You don't democratize, you can still be functional with underdeveloped institutions. No, you will not. Okay? That is why what I'm saying is institutional reforms are a national security issue. They're an economy issue. They're a development issue. Once you connect those, then it becomes a no-brainer to answer your question, what is the most important issue of this government? It's institutional reforms.
So what you're saying is that a year from now, because I hope this is our last state of play that we talk about the elections
Right.
specifically, and we can move on to other issues because there's lots of issues to discuss. So if we look back 1 year from now, what we will want to have seen is some concrete and tangible steps in these kinds of institutional reforms that we keep talking about.
Definitely. And so, what have we seen, for example, in the domain of institutional development on agriculture, in the economic sector? Those are going to be
Energy.
fundamental. Because you said these are ad hoc solutions. I agree. How do you turn ad hoc solutions to systemic solutions? You institutionalize the process. So a year from now, that's what we're going to look at. What is Armenian security going to look like a year from now? The normalization process will continue. TRIP is going to be built. Okay? All those things are going to happen. But is Armenia's military going to be professionalized? Right? It's an institutional reform issue. We can buy all the weapons we want in the world.
And produce all the weapons
And
we
are.
want. Yeah,
But if they are not used, operationalized correctly because you have underdeveloped institutions, what happens to our security situation? Most viewed Russia on paper the second most powerful military in the world. What happened? Because they had underdeveloped institutions and corruption, right? They're struggling in a war
No,
that should dominate.
but it's also about the apricots and the tomatoes, because a year from now, next growing season, when we have the bounty, and Europe is going to say, well, what have you done to
Right.
improve
So last time we
production
did a
or
favor for you,
infrastructure? Yes,
right? But this
exactly.
time we
Yeah.
can't keep doing favors.
Yeah.
So is there a continuity of a relationship that meets our standards, so on and so forth? And so all of this is interconnected to answer your question. So a year from now, right? When we look at the judiciary, have you had judicial reforms? Most judicial reforms are about holding bad judges accountable or previous leaders accountable, be that as it may. But if I'm an investor, right, and I don't trust the legal system in Armenia,
To protect my
I'm not going
investments,
to
right.
invest. So
Yeah.
this is an economic issue. This is a development issue. It's an infrastructure issue. We could talk about this for
Yeah.
hours. Well, that's why my point was institutional reforms aren't simply about democracy. They are, but not simply. It's about making Armenia, right, a strong country, strong state. You can have all the money pouring in, right? You can do all these things we talk about. None of it's going to work
And I would,
unless you address the institutional problem.
and aside from that, another thing that I think we have to talk about and work toward is having alternative political parties that are inherently democratic. Because in 2031, come 2031, we haven't seen the development of organic political alternatives to civil contract and to Prime Minister Pashinyan. Very likely, we're going to have a very interesting and concerning result.
It's going to be very, very complicated
Yeah.
if by 2031 we don't see, as you noted, organic democratic alternatives. We have to understand that all the political parties that we have in Armenia that present themselves as third force or new political party, democratic parties, these are not nationwide parties.
Yeah.
What these parties do is about 4 or 5 months before the elections,
They
pop up and they start campaigning only in Yerevan.
Yeah.
That's not
Yeah.
how politics works, right?
It's
So
not
by
easy.
2031, will we have democratic alternatives that are basically operating, campaigning across
Nationwide.
the country, right? And not simply doing few interviews in Yerevan or running around on Facebook and TikTok and talking
wearing a
about
Spider-Man
specific issues.
uniform. Yeah.
Whatever the case might be, we need some humor, give or take. But this is a very, very important subject of conversation because if by 2031 Armenia does not produce, Armenians with a civil society or demand of the electorate does not produce democratic alternatives, that is also another impediment to consolidation.
Right.
And so we become stuck in this limbo that we keep discussing.
So I'm one of those people, Nerses, who's quite happy that the elections are over. But I'm also very motivated, to be honest, to see what this new administration is going to do. And absolutely couldn't agree with you more about the institutional reforms, because we've been hearing about it. And hopefully now we're at some level of stability in the country. And
regionally, at least.
Regionally, at least, we never know what's going to happen to the south or to the north, but hopefully things will settle down and give us time to breathe and grow and do the reforms that we need to.
Absolutely, and there's elections coming up at the end of this year, local elections throughout Armenia,
Yes.
the municipal elections. Those are something to keep an eye on, and we're going to see what that performance tells us about trends. For example, in 21, even though civil contract won quite easily, they lost 11 of the 18 municipal elections in
Right.
2021. So these are very interesting indicators that are signs of pluralism as well, and sort of the growing sophistication of our electorate. But yes, to your point, the conflict in Iran seems to have been reignited. So how is that going to affect our regional projects, our economy, Russia's continuous subversive activities, or areas of concern that we need to de-antagonize? So, we live in fascinating times. So while the elections, you're happy they're over, I think sort of, we got over one hill collectively as a people, very stable, whatever
We have
the case
mountain
might be.
ranges ahead of us, indeed.
But yeah, it's a continuous process of just pushing that rock up the hill, but
Yeah.
making sure it doesn't roll back down.
Exactly. And that depends on all of us. So thank you, Nerses, for this conversation. Thank you for listening.